So, our last part of the part one series of the skeletal system, we'll be talking about fractures today. And so, we're going to go through some vocabulary and then I'm going to show you some pictures of fractures. This group of pictures that I'm going to show you are actually found in the Google Classroom. So, you may want to pause the video and go pull up the fracture pictures so that you can fill that out as you're listening to the video. We're also going to talk about your discussion question for this unit, which will be on fracture repair. And then after you've completed all of this, you're going to do a fracture activity, and that's also located in the Google Classroom. So let's go through some vocabulary. So there's different kinds of fractures, and when you break a bone, the doctor will go through the list of the classifications and describe your fracture based on where you have broken the bone. So when you break a bone, if the ends stay in position, we call that a non-displaced fracture. But if you break the bone and it's obviously broken so that the bones are out of alignment, it's bending in a place that it shouldn't bend, we would call that a displaced fracture. So another one that we see is complete or incomplete. So a complete fracture, the bone is broken all the way through. So it's a total break from one end of the bone to the other. An incomplete fracture, a lot of times we call this a hairline fracture. The bone isn't broken through. And I know when I was younger, a lot of times people would say it was a cracked bone. The next ones are transverse and linear. Transverse, when you break the bone, it's perpendicular to the bone axis, so kind of across left and right. A linear fracture is going to be parallel to the axis, so it's going to be more of an up and down type break. And then finally, we have open and closed fractures. If you have an open fracture, that means the bone actually breaks through the skin. We call that a compound fracture sometimes. If it's a simple fracture, that means the bone breaks, but it doesn't break through the skin. So that's a simple fracture, sometimes called a closed fracture. So let me pull up the pictures of the fractures. And you're going to find these pictures in your Google Classroom, and you need to write down all of the descriptions of the fractures on the lines that are provided. So this very first picture at the top left, this picture, if you notice, has two arrows going around the fracture. That's because that is showing a very specific fracture that is known as a spiral fracture. Spiral fractures usually happen when you fall on a bone and twist. These are also pretty indicative of child abuse cases. When someone grabs a child's arm and twists really hard, it will cause this spiral fracture. But every spiral fracture does not mean child abuse. You can actually get these sliding into a base, playing baseball. So one title or one name for this classification would be spiral. Also, you'll notice, going back to our descriptions, the bone ends are pretty much in position. So we can also say that that is a non-displaced fracture. Also, it is broken all the way through. So that means that this is a complete fracture. And since it's broken perpendicular to the bone axis, we can also say that it is transverse. And then the last description that we can give it is that it is a simple fracture or closed fracture because it does not break the skin. So for this particular fracture, we can classify it as a spiral, complete, transverse, closed, non-displaced fracture. Okay, now this next picture over here to the right, this is a complete fracture. The bone ends are no longer in line, so it's a displaced fracture. It is transverse because it's perpendicular to the bone axis, and because it has broken the skin, it is an open or compound fracture. On the next line, this very first picture, you'll notice that this hand looks a little different than the others because this is a child's hand. And children can get very special fractures because, remember, their bones are not completely solidified. So a fracture that children will get sometimes is called a green stick fracture. So you can write that down, green stick fracture. And they give it the name because if you go to break a green stick, it splinters rather than breaking in half. And so that's where that name came from. It is an incomplete fracture because it does not go all the way through. We cannot tell if it's transverse or linear, so we're going to leave that alone. And it is a closed fracture as well. Okay. So, and since it's not broken all the way through, it would be non-displaced. All right, then back here, this next one. Now, here in the South, if we see this, we're going to say, oh, they shattered their bone. But we do not say shattered in the medical profession. Instead, we call that a comminuted fracture. Comminuted, comminuted. And that basically means that it's broken into several pieces, okay? Obviously, it's broken all the way through, so it's complete. The bone ends are not in a line, so that one's going to be displaced. It is a transverse fracture, and even though it is not an open fracture, it is closed, it still is a serious one. So don't think that just serious fractures will be ones that are broken through the skin. This is obviously pretty serious and would require some surgery. Right here, this next line, the first picture, we'll see that that is a complete, non-displaced, transverse, closed fracture. And then right here, the last one, this is a skull fracture, and we call that a depressed fracture. It looks like somebody hit them in the head with a frying pan or a baseball bat. So that would be a depressed fracture, and that would be the only thing that we're going to use for that. Okay, so those are our pictures of our fractures. Let's go back to the notes. So right here, I want to show you a picture of Mr. Fortenberry's ankle. He had a comminuted fracture of the talus and ankle, and this is post-surgery when they removed his hardware. And you'll notice, one reason I like to show this, you'll see that there are some signatures on his leg. They make you sign your leg before they do surgery to make sure they do surgery on the right leg. So, but they removed from him plates and screws. He still has one screw in his leg that broke off in the removal of his hardware. So once you break a bone, a couple of things have to happen. One thing that has to happen is it has to be reduced. We call that a reduction, and it's where we realign the broken ends. So if the doctor can do it externally, which means just pull it and pop it back into place, we call that a closed fracture. But if they have to do it with pins and wires, we call that an open fracture and open reduction because they have to actually surgically fix the bone ends again. After it's been reduced, then you'll go through immobilization, and that's where they have to use a cast or a brace to keep the bone in place because we don't want that bone to be rebroken, and we don't want you to put much weight on it. And then depending on the fracture, where it is, and the age of the individual, anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks of healing will be required before they're allowed to go back to, full force on that particular broken bone. So I have this picture. These are some of my one of my former students. His name is Blaine Weeks, and Blaine hit his hand on the side of his truck when he was in high school. And when he did that, he actually broke his 5th and 4th metacarpals. This is actually called a boxer's fracture. It's pretty common in boxers. That's one reason why they tape their hands up before they go into a match. And you can see right here, it doesn't look like it's that bad, but if you look over on this view, you can see that these are obviously displaced fractures. And I think he ended up having to have surgery to reduce those bones and put them back in place. This is a spiral fracture of one of my former students, Jenna Brock, and she slid into a base, and when she did, her leg twisted, and you can see that she has a spiral fracture of the tibia. So when we break a bone, our bone goes through phases of repair, and this will be your discussion question for this unit test. It will be to explain the 4 phases of fracture repair. So the first thing that happens when you break a bone is you have a hematoma form. And so a hematoma is just basically a mass of clotted blood. And so where the bone breaks, the vessels, the periosteum, all that tissue tears and hemorrhages. And so that forms at the fracture. And it's very, very swollen, very, very painful, and very, very inflamed. So then we have fibrocartilaginous callus formation. This is where we're going to build a callus around the broken area and connect the break. And at that point, we're going to start to secrete cartilage that's going to be kind of a temporary patch on the bone. So then after the cartilage forms, we need that obviously to begin to become bone. And so we're going to start to form new trabeculae or spongy bone within that cartilage callus that we formed. And then eventually we're going to convert that to a bony callus. This usually starts 3 to 4 weeks after the injury, but notice that repair continues anywhere between 2 to 3 months after you've broken the bone. So even though you may come out of your cast, it does not mean that the bone is fully healed. And that's why especially if you're an athlete, you may be told to take it a little easy for a while until the bone can continually heal and be completely healed up. And then the last thing is for the rest of your life, really, you're going to go through bone remodeling. And that's where you're going to build and put more deposit around the area that's been broken so that way that bone will continue nice and strong and won't break again. So this is going to finalize part 1 of the skeletal system. I would highly suggest that you go back and study through this. There's a lot of information. As you're studying through your diagrams and things like that, definitely go back through the notes, watch the videos again, and then of course go on and do the fracture activity. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.